Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. By my watch and the clock on the wall, it's 2 o'clock. So welcome to the meeting. The usual items of housekeeping, as always, please keep your mobile phones switched off or on silent mode. We're not expecting a fire drill or alarm testing today, so should there be an alarm, please follow the emergency procedures of the council house, which means leave as quickly as you can. Make sure that you use your microphones when you speak and switch them off after you address the meeting. The important point to remember, of course, we're in the war spike room today, so the cameras will be in action and that will be capable of subsequent repeat viewing. And councillors, by consenting to be here, they are actually consenting for these recordings for webcasting purposes. So before we start the main business of the day, some well, it's not sad news, of course you all know it's happening, but our dear friend Brendan is going to pastures new. So on behalf of the A&G committee and all your colleagues at the council, may we wish you well in your new endeavours, sir.
Chair, that's very kind, but of course you don't know what I'm going to say in the course of the meeting yet. But thank you, that's much appreciated.
One other thing just to remind you of, well, to just let you know, there's some items that's been taken off the agenda. The disclosure and barring checks report, item number 5, is not on it anymore. And we would like to swap 2 items of the agenda around. Our friend Mr. Dossett needs to catch a train, and so we're going to swap item number 6 for item number 13. But before moving on, let's go to apologies. We have one apology, and that's from Mr. Shipley. Moving on to item number 2 of the agenda, which is the usual declarations of interest. Does anybody have aught to declare? I declare that I'm a member of the Devon Audit Partnership Overseeing Committee, and you are Councillor Finn as well, aren't you? Excellent. Moving on to item number 3 of the agenda, to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 25th of July 2022. The minutes of that meeting have been circulated, and I believe there are hard copies in front of you. Do all members present deem to be true reflection? And are there any matters arising? Anything from you, Vice Chair?
No, I'm happy with the minutes, Chair.
So I'm happy to sign them as a true record. So, as I say, we're moving the items of agenda now. Item number 5 has come out, which is the disclosure of barring checks for councillors. So we're taking item number 13 of the agenda, which is the external audit progress report from Mr. Dossett. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for allowing me to bring this item forward in the agenda, and also apologies to members for the late appearance of this report in Supplementary Pack 2. It is quite a complicated process, it's fair to say, this 1920 audit year, and this report is the 1920 audit findings report, which is, as I said, it's in Supplementary Pack 2. And if I take you to the headlines page 3, and what that does is update where we are in terms of the financial statements audit for 1920. Just to sort of bring us to the reasons why we're talking about 1920, 2.5 years after the end of that financial year. The main reason for that delay is due to ongoing discussions about the pensions transaction and the subsequent legality and accounting for that transaction. We are moving towards the end point of that process, which has been a long and arduous one for all sides. And I am reasonably confident that we can get to the end of that process by the end of the year, which ties in with a national issue, which is that at the start of this calendar year, there were issues identified in local authorities with compliance with the SIPFA code on infrastructure assets, and infrastructure assets essentially are in your case, things like coastal defences, but roads, street furniture, etc. And it was found that a lot of local authorities weren't complying with the requirements of the code. So CIPFA have done some detailed work around that and tried to come up with a proposed solution. Their solution was not accepted by the Financial Reporting Advisory Board of the Treasury, who weren't happy with it from an accounting point of view. So now the issue is sitting with DLUC to try and resolve, and they are proposing, we understand, a statutory override to deal with the matter in the short term while CIPFA comes up with a longer term solution. And due to obviously the various challenges of parliamentary time, that statutory override is not expected to be issued until late November, early December. It has already been issued in Scotland, but in England it will be late November, early December. And so effectively all accounts of authorities with material infrastructure assets are on hold. All audit opinions are on hold until that decision comes through. The rest of page 3 sets out some other items that we're needing to finalise with the council. In relative terms, they're quite minor compared to the pension transaction and this sort of national issue on infrastructure assets. If I then turn over to page 4, and we have the value for money arrangements, you'll recall that in local authorities, auditors need to give an opinion on the financial statements, and up until 1920, a conclusion on the value for money. And whilst our work on value for money didn't identify any significant areas in generality in terms of the council's arrangements, in terms of finance and governance, there was this very specific issue of the governance around the pensions transaction and the interest rate swap or hedging instrument that took place. We reported our findings to you last year on that issue, and the council responded very positively to those recommendations and has addressed the issues that we raised in that report. But because obviously the transaction took place in 1920, effectively for purposes of the value for money conclusion, our conclusion is linked to that transaction and the issues we raised around that to 1920, and therefore the value for money conclusion is qualified in that respect. 1920 is the last year of such opinions, and from 2021 onwards, we move to a new form of value for money work, which is called the Auditor's Annual Report, and that report will be coming to your next meeting, and that will actually cover the financial years 2021 and 21-22, and so that will bring us up to date in terms of value for money. But there's no conclusion, there's no opinion in those in subsequent years. This is the last year of the opinions. In terms of, members may wonder what this means, if there are any implications in respect of this. The reality is this is something that happened 2.5 years ago, and whilst we're still working through the accounting issues related to it, it's been gone and done. We can't change history, so I don't think there's any subsequent implications from this particular qualification. This system is closed, so there's no more qualifications to carry forward or anything like that. And certainly in terms of the work we're progressing on the subsequent years, we're not going to be raising further issues about the pensions transaction because we've dealt with it within this report and the report that came to you last year. Just below the value for money section, we talk about statutory duties, and we haven't actually exercised any of our statutory duties as part of the 1920 audit. The rest of the report, as you see, is quite long and detailed and goes through a whole range of issues. I wasn't proposing to go through any of that in any detail, but what it reflects is really what we identified in the audit plan, how we've addressed those, both in terms of the financial statements and in terms of the value for money. So there's more detail on both financial statements and value for money in the report. There's also a series of recommendations, proposed adjustments, and the sort of indicative audit fee at the end as well. So I was proposing, Chair, to stop there, and then obviously happy to take any questions that members have.
Thank you, Paul. Open to the floor. Questions, observations, comments? Councillor Evans.
Not wanting to make a political point, but are the current problems in Westminster likely to change the timetable in your view?
Thank you, Councillor. That's an interesting question because when we discussed the statutory override with DLUC originally, that was prior to the impact of the Queen's death and obviously changes in what the civil service was doing at that time, and obviously prior to the current political challenges. So I don't know whether that will impact that, because of, a minister has to sign off the statutory override, so it will depend on their diaries and their focus, I'd imagine. So I guess anything is possible, and one might be a bit wary at some of these promises. This will be done by November, December. I have seen these things slip in the past, so it's quite possible that it may slip into the new year. One of the things we have said as a sort of generality, we have said this to DLUC, we cannot have this dragging on forever. It has to be resolved at some stage, and I think we would probably take quite a dim view of them sort of putting it off too far, and then we probably start to then go to discussions with individual local authorities to consider whether or not they would prefer, just to close these things down, a qualification. Now, it would be a technical qualification on a matter that doesn't impact on the general fund, but there are issues about the whole of local government accounts being qualified reputationally that might not be what either individual councils would want or the sector as a whole would want. So it's a very delicate issue, but clearly it's in nobody's interest from a governance point of view to leave large numbers of sets of accounts open on a semi-permanent basis, because that's obviously poor governance in itself. So it's an interesting question, Councillor. I'm hoping that their focus will be on delivering this in November, late November, early December.
Any more questions or comments?
Chair, can I just make a point before we close on this item? This has been a very significant and arduous programme of work to get the transaction to the point where, you know, Mr. Dossett is able to say that he's reasonably confident we can see the matter settled by the end of the year. I just would like to publicly thank Paul and Grant Thornton and his team for their pragmatic challenge and the spirit of working together within the context of the audit relationships to solve this problem over quite an extenuated period of time. So thank you, Paul, for that, and I hope that the committee can join me in backing that view up. It has been a most impressive performance from a valued partner. Thank you.
I can certainly endorse that, and we take great assurance from your report, Paul. Any more questions or observations on this item? Sorry to jump around again. I will take Chair's urgent business. I don't usually have any urgent business for this meeting. It's only a small sort of heads up. The spillover from the EGM on the 5th of September has meant that we, of course, going ahead with the consultation exercise on the electoral cycle. Now, as Councillor Evans alluded to at the time, we need to make sure this exercise is done properly, and I, for one, want to see it done with all due diligence. So we are looking for volunteers for what we will call the electoral, what did I call it? The electoral cycle working group. And we do advocate perhaps bringing in other members from other committees as well to get a wider approach. Nobody needs to volunteer now. It's not like the army, but if you would be so kind, if you do wish to volunteer, email me and we'll set up the group as quickly as possible. Thank you. So following the agenda numerical order, we now take item number 6, which is the annual governance statement. And that, I believe, is Mr. Jago.
Thank you, Chair. So the annual governance statement is something you'll see every year. I think, members, you will recognise most of the information, page 3 to 15, which describes our governance framework and system of internal control. From page 15, following consultation with the senior leadership team, that gives you a look back over 21-22 and the actions that we've taken to improve some of our governance or address some governance challenges over that period. And from page 19, you'll be able to see our focus for the coming year, which includes some quite major changes to the operation of the council, including the next phase in the integrated care system, the reforms to adult social care. We also have a number of other constitutional issues we'll need to review over the coming year, and of course the Audit and Governance Committee will be key to that and will be involved in that work. Chair, I think the report is self-explanatory, so would be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jago. Questions, comments, observations? Surely? Somebody?
I'll just like
Yes,
to,
Councillor Larry.
I'd like to clarify the statements made on page 19 and 20 specifically. We'll all be aware that there's an energy crisis, there's a cost of living crisis, and now we've got a financial crisis. So particularly a set of unusual circumstances all happening at the same time. And just slightly concerned by some of the wording on page 19 about the significant gaps that currently exist within the council's financial budget. And therefore the prospects of attaining a balanced budget will not be without decisions that will result in reduction in services, the potential for cessation or deferral of some services, and some reduction in planned headcount. I suppose that comes back to Brendan, because obviously you're the financial director. Did you want to give us your views and opinions in respect to that statement, please?
Chair, I mean, clearly the annual governance statement is here to describe a bigger thing than simply a reference point with some aspect of the council service. So I think the words that are in there accurately reflect the position that the council finds itself in. It has been reporting in its medium-term financial plan a gap of north of £20 million in financial year 23-24, and that's evident in the budget papers that were before council on the 28th of February of this year. And since then, there have been a number of inflationary pressures that have applied, not least the energy price increases in gas, electricity and diesel and petrol, but equally the proposed pay award which the Local Government Employers Association has recommended or offered to staff side. And that pay award is 4% plus, because at the bottom end of the grading structure it provides cash sums for those on lower levels of pay. So that entire proposition in terms of pay introduces a significant pressure to all councils, not just Plymouth. And the reason for that is last autumn, when budgets were being set, the inflation that was being seen, which was expected to peak in March and then fall back, was not thought to be a medium-term issue. Now, events in the macroeconomy have, of course, changed that, as well as international events that we're all aware of in terms of the war in Ukraine and so forth. And a number of issues have led to a bulge in inflation, which looks set to continue for some considerable time, notwithstanding interventions by the Bank of England and the Fed in America and other major institutions. So those pressures are very, very significant. And in terms of how this council and others are able to confront that will depend, of course, on their local circumstances. But here it does look as if this is a settlement that will require the decisions that have been described in that section. So it's simply raising the prospect that those decisions may be necessary. Thank you, Chair.
I welcome your comment, Brendan, and it's nothing I disagree with. And obviously this is a governance report, and I'm looking at governance considerations. And I think where I'm fishing for here is, having had the luxury of being sat in the hot seat when certain financial events take place, I know how challenging it can be, and the hard work that it demands of officers and members to achieve a balanced budget. I'm just slightly concerned now that we're in, like I've said, a very challenging environment. Not only do we have an energy crisis, we have a cost of living crisis, and of course now we have a financial crisis that's going to impact our borrowing considerable. Not everyone will perhaps be aware that we've got, in excess of £500 million in borrowing, and a lot of that is on short-term overnight interest rates, which could change considerably. And therefore my question is, under normal circumstances, the governance arrangements we have in place would be more than adequate. Would like some reassurance that actually, if there is a need for additional governance, or should there be a need for additional governance to be put in place, then we should start thinking about that now, because you've referred to a whole series of significant changes that may well have to take place in this council. And my point being, that could only get worse, and if that does happen, then we need to ensure that our governance is robust.
Chair, if I might come back on that, I absolutely agree with Councillor Lowry in terms of reaching for robust governance. I think the view of CMT, the statutory officers and Cabinet is that we have a system of robust governance. We're a very complex organisation. We deal with difficult, risky decisions which have a significant footprint in the city and beyond as a matter of course. So that said, I think that if there is a feeling in the wider community that additional governance is required, I am sure it's possible for conversations to be had. But I'm certainly of the view that what we have in place in this city is robust, some of the best governance actually that you could wish to see in an authority of this kind, particularly after the governance report that Mr. Dossett was referring to under an earlier item on the agenda. So I'll leave it there, but I do understand the point that Councillor Lowry is making. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, I think the sort of emerging economic situations will feature heavily on various other items of the agenda today. I think the committee take assurance from the hard work that you put on this, and we're very happy to approve the report on this. Anyone else? Oh, sorry, Mrs. Benny, do you want to come in?
Thank you. Yeah, just a very quick one, really. My reflection on Councillor Lowry's comment is really probably when you look through the reporting structure as an example for the medium-term financial plan. I wonder whether it's less about the forums, because that feels that it's set up and it's an infrastructure that seems to work well, but more about timeliness and ensuring that there is appropriate time in each of those fora given to the relevant difficult conversations that may or may not need to be had, so that it's not rushed through, but actually that time is given so that it can be discussed appropriately. So I'm happy with the mechanisms that are shared there, but reflecting on the conversation, I think we do need to stress the importance of having the time to discuss some of what could be very difficult discussions.
Thank you. That's a very good point. Did you want to say something, Councillor Finn? No?
Yeah, just a thought, because of these challenging times, wouldn't it be possible to sort of meet sort of once a quarter, just oversight and review? Obviously, the possibility of defaults on council tax, to depreciation of assets, depreciation of the asset base with regard to pensions, etc., that Councillor Lowry has brought up, implications to short-term borrowing, so that we as a committee are on the ball should there be a major change from the Bank of England with regard to interest rates, etc.
Very astute, and you've jumped the gun because later on in the agenda that we have thought about a mechanism for briefings and sort of updates. But it is a very good point you make.
Chair, may I just make one final point, because my apologies, Councillor Lowry did refer to another matter, which is short-term borrowing. And the position has been that the council, along with many others, has taken advantage of short and cheap borrowing in recent years when it was available. Something of a historic anomaly, but along with other councils, we certainly engaged in those transactions. However, with appropriate foresight, we started moving out of that short and cheap portfolio of borrowing some time ago. And so very significant reductions have been made, not only by the interest rate swap, which Mr. Dossett was referring to earlier, but actually a set of decisions to move into long-term fixed rate debt rather than depending on short-term debt with the prospect of a rising interest rate environment. And so we feel relatively well prepared to address that interest rate environment now compared with where we were 2 years ago. So just thought I'd make that point for clarification, as Councillor Finn had also referred to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. Yes, as one of the points I was going to bring up on the accounts when we looked at this, the sort of borrowing that local authorities give us on a short-term sort of loan. Yes, thanks for the clarification.
Chair, we have got Treasury Management on the agenda item for today, so I'll respond further in that discussion, I think. Thank you.
Excellent. So, moving, anything else on that before I close that item on the agenda? Move on to item number 7. Oh, sorry, Councillor Evans, yes.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, the Local Government Association peer review, can I make sure to declare, I think it's an interest, I'm not quite sure what. I do need to declare that. Could I ask though, it says the action plan is reviewed regularly by the corporate management team with required reporting to the Cabinet and Council when necessary. What does when necessary mean, and who decides what is necessary?
Certainly, we on the Treasury report later on the agenda, we are going to talk about an update. But as a general question, I suppose it is a state of flux, as and when required, when we're given a red flag, presumably. Brendan?
Sorry, I think Councillor Evans was talking about the peer review, if I may have misheard, rather than Treasury matters. And so that is a regular item which is under consideration by the corporate management team. I don't know whether my colleague, Mr. Perrick, can advise when that is next likely to be discussed. I believe in the fairly near future. Thank you, Chair.
It's thank you, Brendan. Chair, it's and Councillor Evans. It's in front of the performance and the scrutiny committee with performance in its title. I think they'll consider it, and they'll probably, I was going to say make recommendations, probably request/instructions to the officers who are there about the regularity with which they want to receive feedback, but also they might major on individual items rather than sort of taking all the recommendations en bloc. But I think that'll be quite a detailed discussion at the next committee meeting, and I think that part of the purpose of that discussion is to identify the regularity and type of reporting that the scrutiny, and of course it's at liberty to suggest updates to other other bodies other than just the performance scrutiny committee. So hopefully that will be quite a fruitful discussion at that meeting, and I think it's in October.
Thank you very much. Moving on to item number 7 of the agenda, we have the scrutiny risk management update to be presented by Mr. Jago.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Quite a short report. In response to Councillor Lowry's request at the last meeting. following that meeting, what we've done is made sure that scrutiny committees receive a cut of strategic risk register to consider at their meetings, and then use that to populate their work programme. I would have liked to have come with more information as a result of their considerations, but unfortunately, due to the period of mourning, we needed to move most of our scrutiny committees into October. So we've just changed around the cycle a little. So I would expect to be able to provide a fuller report at the next meeting of this committee. But it probably is worth pointing out that certainly members of the Health and Social Care Scrutiny Committee have used the risk register to identify some issues around the adult social care reforms. And certainly on their next agenda, they'll be looking to review some of the fair cost of care work, which is currently being undertaken in the People Directorate. Thank you, Chair.
Any questions be directed to Mr. Jago on this item? No? We note the report with grateful thanks. Moving on now to item number 8 of the agenda, the Audit Action Review, which is quite a lengthy document. And I believe Mr. Lobies will kindly present that one.
Thank you, Chair. This is the regular report that comes to Audit Committee on the achievement of internal audit and external audit recommendations. There are no external audit recommendations on this report in terms of outstanding ones, but there will obviously be management responses made to the audit reports that Grant Thornton provide. So in essence, it really is a report for noting to give members an understanding of how things are moving forward. The first pie chart just gives you a breakdown of those recommendations in terms of fully implemented, partially implemented and outstanding. There's been quite obviously a lot of audit activity in recent months, a number of reports being completed, and a number of recommendations in various stages of implementation. So table 1 gives you a breakdown of what the status is, and then table 2
Paul,
then.
Sorry to interrupt you. I know this is a very complex subject matter that many members enjoy as much as me, but perhaps given the significance of what's happening in markets, you perhaps explain each of those tables in a little bit more detail than you might normally do so all members are fully aware of exactly what is going on. Because they may be asked by other members or by people themselves as to how much debt have we got, how much borrowing have we got, how much
Sorry,
of this have we got.
I think I'm talking about a different report. I'm talking about the Audit Actions Review, the
sorry, I'm
internal
on
audit.
Treasury Management.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Okay.
Is that okay with
It's me confusing the agenda. This is my fault entirely.
So when you do get there, maybe do exactly that, all right?
Well, fortunately, I'm going to pass over to a colleague of mine, but we can come in a moment. No, so this, as I said, on table 2, it then just identifies those internal audit recommendations that have not yet been implemented. And there's a brief summary as to the status of those, where we are in terms of implementing them. So that was all I was going to say, Chair. I don't think any questions myself or Brenda can try and answer them.
Chair, if I may just add a few thoughts. Clearly, there is no complacency about those 36 actions that are overdue, and management will be pursuing those vigorously. We would hope by the next meeting of the committee, which I believe is in November, that a more positive perspective can be enjoyed in regard to those 36. Thank you.
Certainly, indeed, you cleared quite a few action points off the list, so many thanks. And any other questions or observations to make to Paul? Oh, Mrs. Benny wanted to come. Yeah, do come in.
Thank you. It was just really so I can see from that we've got the number of tasks and the good progress of implementation from June. Is it? I suppose I'm interested just to get a sense of the workload in the 47% yet to start. Is it broadly half of what you've had, or are they harder and therefore going to take longer? I've got no sense of that, because some things can take a huge amount of time, can't they? And it can be a long time before it's ticked off. So I'm just interested to understand what's behind that 47% in terms of workload compared to what's already been ticked off to date.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's going to be a mixed bag of reasons. I mean, some of them are clearly due to resource issues and staffing issues, where it will take time for recommendation to be implemented. If I look at my own area, we had a report which identified a number of low priority recommendations within our capital and treasury management audit, and because of resource issues, because of ongoing restructure, we have not had time yet to implement them. I think also it could be complexity. Some of the recommendations do take time, and it obviously, you're right, this report doesn't provide that level of detail. It really just gives you an overview as to the status. But as Brendan said, the hope would be that there'll be, I suppose it could be like a bit of a roller coaster. The figures may improve one quarter and then go down the next, depending on when the reports have been issued, when this report's produced. But I don't know, Brendan, if you've got any specific items you want to help me out with on that.
I'm just mindful, Chair, that, thank you, Paul, that when audit reports are produced, the actions are also always associated with a timeline. So there's always a planned date, and that's the basis for the conclusion that there are 36 items that are overdue. So I think it's quite right to say that there will be some items that are really quite complex, that involve in some cases quite significant project work to deliver. Others might be very simple and involve a quite minor change but important change to process or whatever. And as Paul says, you've got the whole gamut of actions at one end or the other end of that polarity. So the key thing is whether they're overdue, and that is what the list at table 2 describes, and that's the context of my reference to 36 items that management will pursue with vigour to make sure that we can bring that number down. It does seem to me, Chair, that it might be helpful moving forward to begin tracking in time the metrics that are presented in this report. So in other words, we can see how many actions there are in total over time, how many have been delivered, how many are outstanding. That might be an important dimension to understand whether the council is getting better at that or worse. And I'm reasonably hopeful that we'll see a positive story and a downward trend in terms of those that have not been delivered to timetable. So I offer that to you for future adoption, Chair, in the context of this report. Thank you.
I think that makes a great deal of sense. I mean, we use tracking as a valuable tool in other items of the agenda. I can't see any reason why we can't endorse it for this. Perhaps we come back to that one and move on to the audit action review. Moving on to the internal audit progress report, which I think we will ask Brenda if you would be so kind to present.
Thank you, Chair. This is a fairly self-explanatory report. It's the progress of the work of the team as it stands in August for the audit plan that was agreed by this committee in March of this year. What is quite interesting, actually tracking and looking against the work we did last year, is the additional number of grants that we've already audited in year. At the point of writing, there were 25 grants certified, whereas last year, for the whole year, just 23 grants, which actually is probably indicative of the work of the authority and the success that they've had in the authorities had in actually attracting new money, which I think is something to celebrate. I don't plan to go through the report because I'm sure members have read it, but what I would say is, because of the current changes in financial environment where we sit at the moment with the war in Ukraine, the impact of that, the budgetary pressures, I will be meeting shortly with members of the corporate management team to actually review the items that are in the audit plan to see if they're still the right items or if the risk profile has changed. And obviously that will be reported back to this committee in November as part of our half-year report. So happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, my initial note is the high level of borrowing. Of course, you know, that's symptomatic of the time that we're living in at present. But I think Councillor Evans, you had a question?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, it is a success that we've had all these grants, and congratulations to the officers. But I mean, I think it's also fair to say that 10 years ago, a lot of these grants would have been coming to us in revenue support grant. And so it would be just a straightforward question, no side to it, but do we have any figures for how much audit time is being spent on this particular block of work? You just are some round figures with, or of hours or money, whichever you prefer.
I don't have those figures to hand, Councillor Evans, but I can certainly provide them to you, to members, if you want it in due course.
A part of a case that's being made at the moment by local government is that we're all spending a lot of time chasing small, relatively small amounts of money. And then once, if you've landed it, then there's the awesome prospect of putting it into practice. So it would be a good sense, to be honest, in making a case, say for Plymouth, a relatively successful city in doing this, exactly what damage is done to our finances and our work programmes just by being successful. I'm shooting in the dark at the moment, and it would be good to have that information at some point soon.
That's fine, I'll get that, I'll pass it across.
Any more questions or observations on this item? No? Thank you very much indeed, Brenda, for a comprehensive report. The committee notes the content. I believe you're up next again, Brenda, with item number 10 on the agenda, which is the whistleblowing policy. Members will be aware, of course, that the council does have an existing policy. This is amendments to the existing document. Brenda.
Thank you, Chair. This policy comes before Audit and Governance Committee on a regular basis. It's not a huge amount of change. All the changes to the policy are in red text for members' ease. The policy over a period of time has been discussed with trade union leaders, with HR, with colleagues in legal services. Members, the portfolio holder is also he asked for some words around Nolan's 7 principles in public life. So I think I've incorporated all the changes that everybody's asked for in the policy. The policy makes clear around protected characteristics that sits outside of the whistleblowing policy. If somebody's got raising a complaint and a concern about that, to actually signpost them where to go, that sits under the grievance resolution policy and procedure. So if anybody's got any questions, Chair, I'd be happy to field them.
Certainly, yeah, there's a question. Can I just ask a quick one, looking at 1.3 on page 3 of 8 of the report? I mean, presumably this is just adding in members into the whistleblowing policy, the red track changes there?
Members were always a part of the whistleblowing policy, always incorporated into it. It's trying to bring clarity, and the monitoring officer, Emma, would like to come in.
Pleased to hear from you, Emma.
Thank you, Chair. The addition is to make it clear that where the event that is being complained of concerns a councillor's behaviour, it's properly dealt with through standards as opposed to whistleblowing, if that makes sense. So the addition is to try and bring that clarity around it, because ultimately it's a slightly different process in terms of dealing with complaints about councillors' conduct.
Thank you, Emma. Councillor Evans?
I was going to ask you about that, actually, because there was a complaint made last year about a particular councillor under whistleblowing, and we ended up having the complainant investigate. Before you came, I think, and and I wanted to sort of find. I'm anxious to make sure there isn't a special rule for councillors. Because my understanding of, you know, in terms of grievance and in terms of this, there's kind of some legal force behind it. Sometimes when things go into the standards process, they get washed away or not properly dealt with. And some of those charges are very serious. In terms of councillors' conduct, we often have to, we've got a policy there that deals with very, very serious stuff and very, very trivial stuff, but it's all in the same bracket. And I suppose what I'm concerned to make sure is that we're not letting councillors off lightly if they do the wrong things. And I'm just wondering where the discussion is about this and where we have the rehearsal of those arguments. Because, I mean, this might not be the place, it might be somewhere else, but if it isn't here, where is it? So there's that. And I mean, you know, I do want to say that sometimes councillors do need to blow the whistle without it being tossed into this, you know, boiling cauldron of, what can I say, partisanship. There needs to be a place where it exists in its own right and on its own terms, right? And, you know, so it would be useful to know where we could have a conversation about that. Because if we do this today, I presume it's just, that's it now. So if I object to that through a lack of understanding or a lack of conversation about it, I have no option other than to vote against, and I don't want to do that. But I do want these conversations rehearsed so we don't have a repetition of councillors being discouraged from whistleblowing.
So what you're saying, Councillor Evans, is basically we need to review it in more detail and ask for more information before we approve this document.
I'm still reeling from the way in which a complainant was treated when they made a complaint. I'm still reeling from that, okay? Because given the nature of the complaint, it was so serious that I was surprised that the complainant was the one that was investigated rather than the person who was complained about. And so, you know, as I say, it'd be interesting to me to see where these conversations are taking place, who's deciding on them, and where do we have our say?
Councillor Toffin.
Working. Just wondering, do we have a single point of contact for the employees and the councillors where we can obviously go email or phone number, where we can go for the whistleblower? This is the first question. The second question is, we going to be treated exactly the same as the employees of the council? And the third one, might be the only internal one, do we go first to the leader, our leader in terms of the Conservative Party leader, to complain? What is the escalation of the problem in terms of we have a problem, we go first to the leader, or we go direct to yourselves, guys? Or which was the structure, you know? Where do we go and how high do we need to go to sort out the problem?
Would you like? You, Wendy? Yeah.
Okay, I'll start. At the last page of the report, there is key contact information. So it gives you telephone numbers and email addresses as to where you can escalate a problem or you can take a problem to, which includes ourselves as Devon Audit Partnership, who are completely independent, legal services, human resources. If you need, and obviously that should be a last point, you know, port of call, but you can go outside of the council to protect, which is the formerly public concern at work, and then you've got the ombudsman. So there are a range of options available to people. That is all in the report. The report lays out that ideally we would like the preference is for people to blow the whistle early on, somewhere within their line management at some level within the organisation, or in your cases within the party. But clearly, if that is not possible, the individual concerned doesn't think that's a comfortable thing for them to do, then they've got the other options. And from my perspective, and I'll hand over to Emma now, but I would see that members would need to take advice on this then from legal services, would, as I would see it.
Thank you, Chair. Legally, anything to do with a councillor's conduct in their capacity as a councillor has to be dealt with through the standards regime. So if there was a complaint which related to the conduct of a councillor acting as a councillor, it wouldn't be through the whistleblowing policy. That's what the comment's trying to capture. It would be through the standards regime. If there was somebody who wanted to raise an issue with a councillor when they weren't acting in a capacity as a councillor, but they still had legitimate concerns about something, it would go through the whistleblowing process rather than the standards, because they're not behaving as a councillor in that capacity. So that's what the comment is trying to clarify, that there are two regimes, and it very much depends about when the complaint comes forward, what hat the councillor was wearing at the point at which the incident to be complained of occurred.
Just to come back, so the councillor punched them on the nose in a meeting of the council. Clearly, they therefore go to standards. The council punched them in the nose, but the meeting had finished. Then, so I mean, this is what we're getting into, and you know, like I say, that it isn't often the issue in the capacity in which the council was acting. It's the fact that something happened. That's the bit I'm anxious about. While we're prevaricating about which, you know, do I complain here or do I complain there? You know, things can be timed out by the time we get round to deciding where they go. So I'm just so worried about this thing around, you know, first of all, one councillor has to complain against another councillor, rather than being absolutely being able to say something without retribution to them. That's the bit that's why I'm anxious that the councillors don't lose their right to whistleblow, but they would in this case. They would.
I think it's a strong point that you make, Councillor Evans. And of course, this committee is all about checking process and governance of process. Is there a time, asking the officers a question, is there a time constraint on getting this amended report approved? Or do we have a bit of flexibility where we could perhaps revisit and test various other parts of it?
Chair, can I just pick up one point on this? It does seem to me that this is quite clear, that actually under law there are two routes, and in terms of anyone, you know, being unclear as to which route to pursue, or indeed wanting to understand the conditions that apply to their particular case, the way this operates in most councils is that recourse is made to the monitoring officer, who will quite properly provide advice and clarify the position. So I'm not sure that there is a great risk of the prevarication that Councillor Evans has mentioned, although I do understand why that would be a concern. But it does seem to me that procedurally this is actually quite clear. But my colleague might want to comment further.
Mr. Perrott?
I shall avoid commenting either on the accountancy or legal aspects of this. I think clearly there's concerns raised by a member of the Audit and Governance Committee, and at the very least a firm and complete understanding of what is in fact a difficult area of law in terms of which where discretions for councils begin and end, and where the statutory approach to these things. I think we've all struggled enormously with the reforms that took place in 2010 onwards to the local government standards regime. And if I'm honest, as an officer, they introduced a statutory grey area that that many councils have struggled with ever since that period. And I think probably, I know members of this committee are aware of the fact that the Committee for Standards in Public Life has made extremely strong recommendations to more than one government, I have to say, about the absolute need to clarify and change the primary legislation. And the LGA, when it did all the work around the revised model code of conduct that this council adopted with a couple of improvements, I'd say, but anyway, amendments earlier on, the LGA have made exactly the same point. And I might get into trouble for saying this, but we were extremely disappointed that after a several-year wait, the then Minister with responsibility in this area, Kemi Badenoch, having promised a response for some time, came back with the amazing announcement that she wasn't going to do anything about it in the foreseeable future. So the issue that we're stuck on is the statutory application of the standards regime. I think what's been made very clear by Councillor Evans today, that time spent in properly sharing understandings and issues with this, it's not so much, there might be something wrong with the policy we're putting forward, but it's got to be easy to use, able to be challenged and properly clarified to our members in order for it to be effective. And so never mind its accuracy or legality at the moment, if we've got more work to do in order to make sure that that happens and it's really easy to use and everybody understands the, I grant you, difficult areas that it covers off, which are not of the council's making, they're of the legislation's making, I feel, then I don't believe, but I would look to Brenda and Emma, that basically until this is revised, the old policy is in place. Do you see what I mean? So it's not that we're left in an abyss with no whistleblowing policy, and it might be appropriate for this committee to say, let's take some more time to really promote an understanding of this and thrash out any issues that are of remaining concern to members before actually adopting it. I think it would be good practice to do that, and I don't think there's a reason why we'd be causing difficulties by postponing the adoption on behalf of the council of this process in the meantime.
Thank you, Giles. Mrs. Benny would like to come in.
Yes, it's building on what Mr. Parrott was saying there. Really, for me, when I sort of read through this, and again, similar to Councillor Evans, I've witnessed and watched in other organisations whistleblowing, and the impact on the person who's whistleblowing, and the impact on them from a personal perspective, and also on their careers. So the bit I'm really interested to sort of dig around a bit and get some assurance on is the bit around, so we've got the safeguards on page 38, at the bottom of the page, around harassment and victimisation. And it says, we will not tolerate it as a council and we'll take action. And I'm seeking assurance there around, and actually, how do we ensure that happens? So how do we ensure that staff are protected, our colleagues who choose to whistleblow are not victimised, and that we can take the action? Because for me, there's a level of organisational development, there's maybe training, and I'm interested to understand what's going on there. And it may be that actually we need a bit more information there around what to expect.
Thank you. Good point. I think does anyone else wish to make some comments on this? Because I do have the general feeling that we do perhaps need a little bit more time to consider this in more detail before we approve the amendment to this policy. Is that the general consensus around the table?
Yes.
So thank you very much for all the hard work on it. Bit of tweaking, I think, just a bit of overview, and then hopefully next time we will be in a position to approve.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair, we will.
Right, we move on to item number 11 of the agenda, which is the Treasury Management Outturn Report, which again is another lengthy financial document.
Indeed,
and
thank you.
That Brendan
Chair.
is...
Well, I'll lead off, but it will be a team response today, I think.
Wendy's volunteering by all accounts.
Of this. So what we have here is the financial year 21-22 outturn report specifically on Treasury matters. Now, in terms of outturn reports generally on the general fund, those are generally produced earlier in the financial year, and this one has been delayed a little because of staff shortfalls in the Treasury area. And we're grateful that Wendy has picked this up and now put this together. So will have read it, but I think Councillor Lowry's suggestion that we go through the tables and actually explain what they're doing and the points they make is probably a good one. So let's, if it's all right with you, Chair, and the committee, let's commence on that journey. So the first one is Table 1. And what this is attempting to do is to establish the level of borrowing that is needed by the council, given A, the amount of schemes that it has that are fit for borrowing, and secondly, making sure that we don't borrow unnecessarily. So where it says less usable reserves, less working capital, that's the council making use of the cash that is in its accounts from day to day and coming to a judgment around, well, we've got cash to that particular amount, and therefore in the medium term looking forward, we don't need to to borrow the gross amount that's set there in the table of the capital financing requirement. So we've got the numbers there, the 688, the movement during the year and the actual at the year end. And what we're saying is that during that period, there was a level of cash we already had that we didn't need to borrow for. And we therefore express the net borrowing at the bottom of the table. So that's what that first Table 1. Exactly. Yeah. So that's a good thing because it means we spend less on borrowing. So happy to take any questions on that one.
Councillor Evans.
So not something that happens every year then? To a greater or lesser extent. So what are we looking at for the forthcoming year then?
So I'm not sure whether Wendy has a figure for that, but it is something that we would do habitually because we're always carrying large cash balances for one reason or another. And that's because of the receipt of grant, the receipt of other monies coming in from government. And that's netted off, of course, against the liabilities that we discharge through our payment runs and other payments that we make. So there will always be a cash balance. I'd be surprised if it was very different in the current year from what we've got here. But Wendy, I don't know if you have those numbers with you.
But also, sorry to interject, but the cash balance, you are buying smaller investments from liquidity, aren't you? You're using the cash balance to buy other investments.
Yes, the cash is invested on a daily basis, depending on its incidence in the cash flow.
Mrs. Eldridge.
Can I just clarify, it was specifically about COVID grants? Yes, so at the point 31st of March 22, a lot of the COVID grants had already come in and been paid out. So whilst there would have been a small balance carried over, because I think the scheme sort of closed around the October 20, later in that year, there would have been, like I say, we haven't got a definitive amount, but most of the schemes would have been paid out. Thank you.
So if we move on then to Table 2, so this one in headline terms is describing the borrowing activity. So in other words, where has borrowing come from? And it shows the position at the start of the year and at the end. So Wendy, you might want to unpack the detail of that a little further.
Well, I think the table does actually set out a previous action referenced by Brendan, where the council did take advantage of lower interest rates that it could secure over a longer term, in this case 50 years, with the Public Works Loan Board, PWLB. So significant movement was transferred with our loans from short-term borrowing, which would be with other local authorities for 1 year, across to PWLB, where we were able to gain rates ranging from 1.37% to 2%. Obviously, now with a bit of hindsight, that was a very safe move with some of the rates we're seeing coming through. So that's the sort of the key arrangements. The bank's lending option, borrowing option, that's remained quite static. That's again quite long-term borrowing at higher rates. But we haven't entered into any more borrowing with that. And then the report then goes into removing deducting our long-term liabilities, which would be through finance leases, etc., and deducting the total investments that's explained further on table 3. So we have actually shown a reduction in our borrowing activity from 628 million to 577. But the significant point of that is where we've used cash and we've protected, or we've addressed some of the interest rate risk.
Just to pick up a sort of refinement of that. So where it says short-term borrowing, that refers to the point that Councillor Lowry was mentioning earlier. So if you see the first column, it says balance on the 1st of April 21, 463 million. The 235 reflects where that debt has matured, and the 187 in the column above shows where we have invested in fixed rate debt in order to avoid exposing the council to interest rate variability, which of course is exactly where we are now. So that just links back to the question that Councillor Lowry asked earlier.
Brendan, in that table though, where is the interest rate credit swap shown? It can't be in the public loan world. Is it still in the short-term debt?
It would be shown in short-term borrowing, but the interest rate hedging arrangement didn't really kick in last year because interest rates were below the hedging amount. But obviously, go forward 12 months and you'll see it quite noticeably within that, and we'll make reference to it in the written word.
So if we move.
Sorry, before we move on, Brendan, Councillor Finn, opposite.
From a layman's perspective, then, what you're actually saying within those figures are you've removed short-term debt into long-term debt.
Yes, so we've moved from short-term variable rate into long-term fixed.
So how long is the fix?
50 years.
So 50 years.
The new debt is 50 years.
Is there any ceiling as a percentage of income that we're actually using to say that this debt becomes unsustainable, or we need to reduce it?
So the way that works within the Prudential Code is that all our liabilities associated with long-term debt and the financing of the capital programme are closely monitored. So if there were to be a point that we became unable to service the debt we already have, then it's too late at that point to do anything about it, because we've obviously spent the money on capital assets and we need to finance them. So what we do is, through the medium-term financial planning process, we carefully look to see what is affordable, and so we're clear around what the liabilities are that the council is facing in future. Now, it's important to note that in Plymouth, unusually, a very high proportion of our capital spend is financed by capital grant or by other contributions, and the amount financed by corporate borrowing quite modest. So to give an example, our approved programme earlier this year was about 400 million, and of that, corporate borrowing was funding about 80 million, and the rest of it was government grants of one sort or another. Now, that's a highly unusual position, and it's testament to the quality of the work done in our Place Directorate and various teams there in acquiring those resources. So we're in actually quite a beneficial position in terms of the overall load that we have to accept in running such a large programme because of that success. So that's an important point to think about compared with other authorities of our size and complexity.
Yes, also Councillor Irish has pointed out, Councillor Finn, that there's a summary of that on page 44, which will help as well on a couple of tables at the top. More further questions?
Table 3 then, Chair. So Wendy, do you want to take us through table 3, please?
Yeah, table 3, again, this just really sets out where the council has its investments with the sort of first line is our sort of short-term investments that we would hold in the bank at the end, and again this is where we would try and aim to hold a minimum amount in the bank by to ensure that we don't increase our reliance on borrowing. The average rate yield was quite low, which reflected the fact that the interest rates were low for loans, so that followed through for investments. Our money market funds, this is where we do, this is almost like a deposit account that you'd have with your own banking, where you'd put money away, which would secure us a sort of, in this term, to 2 decimal points. It wasn't any higher interest, but it was slightly higher than just holding it in the call account. And then our other pooled funds, which is our main investment holding, were set up several years ago, and benefits we've seen in the last financial year 21-22 is the increase in return and value of those funds, which has then generated 2.5%, which is so overall our investments on a monetary terms have increased from 97 million to 101 million, but that's mainly through the improved valuation of our pooled funds.
Chair, I think it's also important to recall that during the lockdown process and the dislocation of the economy, both internationally and domestically, some of those pooled funds did sustain a loss in their capital value for a period of time. And it's pleasing to see that those have now recovered the shortfall that we experienced at that time. And the yield that we receive is a substantive contribution to reducing the net running costs of the council.
Councillor Lowry.
I think once again, Brendan makes a very valid point. We don't invest for a day, we invest 50 years, you know, so we don't play the money markets. Those investments that I and many of us were a party of, we make those decisions over a very long term. Councillor Kelly, when those funds were at the bottom of the floor, demanded that we sell them. Thankfully, we managed to convince him of another approach, and as Brendan has reminded us, those values have increased substantially, and we're a lot better off financially as a consequence. So, yes, the market does change from day to day, and we've seen events of the last week that scared many of us, but the investments this council makes are very long term, and whilst we should be very mindful of what happens on a day-to-day basis, we shouldn't necessarily start making decisions purely on that basis alone.
I think it's a valid point. I mean, certainly the investments do look strong, and there's definite growth there, which certainly is admirable. I mean, what does concern me, though, is whilst the amount of loans decreased by 46 million, the council still got a horrendous amount of debt. When you look at the aggregate on, well, I'm sure you're coming on to the next table, it's 725 million. So, sorry to interject, I'm sure.
No,
Caught you out
sorry,
mid-flow.
Chair, carry on. Are you ready to go to table 4, or did you have a question? I'm sorry. You're happy to go to table 4. Thank you. So this is bringing together a summary of the Treasury Management outturn position and summarises its impact on the revenue ledger. So I'll let Wendy take us through that.
Yeah, just to explain, the table really sets out in really three main blocks. First block relates to the interest payable, and as you can see from that, there was a 2.9 million saving against the budget with that forecast. That was again as a result of low interest rates, and as you can see from the figures, the temporary loans, which is our short-term borrowing, were considerably low interest rates compared to PWLB at the time. Then we go into the second block is against our interest rates payable. Again, a lot of this would be of pooled funds, which, as Councillor Lowry explained, is our long-term investment plans, long-term investments. And then the third block is around our actual management of our treasury management functions, with other payments to our advisors, Arling Close, and debt management expenditure that we incur with brokers securing short-term loans. And then the final, a separate line, is around the minimum revenue provision, which is a requirement the council needs to make provision for to meet its capital financing requirement, which again was slightly lower than budget. But overall, a net underspend of 0.49 million was generated in 21-22.
Excellent. I mean, looking at that third block, I mean, yes, interesting that the debt management involves brokerage fees and so on and so forth. So what would be other payments above it?
The other payments would include where we pay advisors. It'd be quite a chunk of transactions we've lumped together in there over a multitude of lines. So that would be certainly Arling Close. It's the main one I can think of.
Further questions, observations?
We have an explanation as to what the 3.34 million is in for reserves and what that's been earmarked against, please.
3.4 was it?
Okay, this was in light of the outturn provision, transfers to reserves were provisions for entries that potentially could impact on Treasury Management outturn, the Council's outturn position for 21-22. There are still matters will be coming through from the audit report from completing of 19-20 onwards. So just covering matters with that.
Thank you. Do you want to take us to the next stage, Brendan?
So I think that's the last numbered table. What we have left on page 11 of the report is the prudential indicators, and all of those have been delivered, activities have been delivered within these. The prudential code is a quite, at first sight, complicated piece of equipment, but what it essentially does is encourage councils to look in detail at the level of, well, the cost of their capital investments and their treasury activities, and making sure that they can be funded through the revenue account. And therefore, the council is required to set limits of various kinds around that activity. And the idea being that if those limits are breached, then it sets off a big red flashy light, and actually the council has an opportunity then to consider how it wishes to deal with that, and to consider the wider affordability of the plans that it is pursuing. So what these little tables, which aren't numbered, do is simply express the fact that we are sitting within our prudential indicators, and that the burden is acceptable and affordable to the council. So if there is wider interest in the prudential code as such, it would take quite a long time to explain it all here, but it might be that the Treasury panel that we have set up, which is a cross-party event which all members are invited to, there could be a briefing session on the Prudential Code at one of those in the future, if members would find that helpful.
Thank you, Brendan. Councillor Lowry would like to make a comment.
Just like to thank officers for all their hard work in respect to this report. It does exactly what it needs to do. I think we may need to look at page 43 in the table that exists in the second table, because there's obviously an adding up issue there that needs to be addressed, and that should read 6, 7, 8 by my reckoning. Yeah. And obviously on page 45 refers to the last paragraph and the recommendations. May I suggest, given what we're all fully aware of that's happening in the markets at the moment, that we do note the Treasury Management Report. We do recommend the report to full council. But I'd also suggest that we have an interim statement that goes to both the Audit and Governance Committee and to full councils. All that's going to happen is everyone's going to say, oh, what about today? You know, because this report was written previously for the last 12 months and is historic now, and it does what it needs to do. But I think it needs an interim statement to sit alongside of it, calming some nerves as to what the issues relate to for ourselves moving forward, Chair.
Could I come back? I can answer your question on that one, Councillor Lowry. I mean, we are having the Treasury Management panel meet on the 28th of this month. It would be a good idea if we had some sort of representations made from that panel to this committee periodically to try to allay fears and keep us posted, given the fact that we are in a state of flux financially. Is there anything else to add?
Chair, I mean, I think that's a very good idea to provide an interim statement for the assurance of members, and I'm sure, as noted, I won't be here to do it, but I'm sure the team will pick that up and run with it in the days ahead. Thank you.
Are there any more questions or comments to make about this item before we approve it?
People get teasy about that sometimes.
What would we do without you for your eagle eye, Councillor Lowry? Item number 12 on the agenda, again, a lengthy financial document, is the statement of accounts. This, I understand, will not be presented formally because certainly the financial information has been circulated around, but it's a very lengthy document. We would like, of course, to ask questions and analyse those statements of accounts before they are approved. Who would like to start?
Chair, it might be worth just a few words of introduction. So what you have here is the statement of accounts for 21-22. As you can tell from the length of the document, it is an increasingly complex task to put that together. And my colleague Carolyn Haynes and Paul Luby work very hard with their team in doing that, and it becomes an ever more testing exercise. In this particular occasion, of course, there are potentially further adjustments that will need to be made to this document as it goes on its path through to audit by Paul and his audit team, and then the expression of the final audit opinion. And the two principal issues there are the valuation of infrastructure assets that has already been described. We may get a statutory override for that nationally, or we may not. So there may be some further adjustments to make in that regard. The other one is the addition of whatever accounting arrangements are agreed in order to deal with the MEL pension transaction as previously referred under another agenda item. But we are clear about how that would work if it is agreed, and work is already commencing to make sure that the statements are adjusted in line with that, pending the agreement that we have a reasonable expectation of, as Mr. Dossett referred earlier. So it is here. Why is it here? Are we expecting you to go through it line by line? Well, I know Councillor Lowry probably has done that, but actually what it is here for, and it's very useful that he does so, it's here that you can take assurance as a committee that you've got a competently put together set of financial statements, that you're able to exercise some challenge on bits that you're curious about or in any sense worried about, or simply don't have an understanding of, and from the quality of the answers you get take some further assurance from that so that it can be approved and then moved forward. Paul, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say on this item.
I just wanted to make a couple of observations because there's various things have cropped up during this meeting already. We talked about grant funding. Well, on page 74 of the agenda, which is page 20 of the narrative report, which is like an introductory part of the statement of accounts, there's quite a lot of information about COVID grants. I believe we received, we spent just under 38 million in 21-22 COVID grant monies. 13 of that was brought forward from the previous year. So there's quite a lot of detail there if you would like to, if you want to have a look at it. There's also on page 146 of your agenda, quite a lot of detail about revenue and capital grant funding. So if you want to know who we receive funding from, then there's a lot of detail that is gathered. So really, I suppose I'm saying that a lot of the information that you might want or find interesting is in this document if you have the time to look through it. We talked with Wendy about borrowing. If you look at notes 18 of which is on page 68 of your agenda, that covers all of the financial instruments. So in theory, it should back up what Wendy has in her Treasury Management Outturn report. And in my covering report, I just gave some high-level figures in relation to movements on the balance sheet. So, for example, I mentioned that short-term borrowing is reduced by 236 million. Well, that backs what Wendy said in her Treasury Management report, and the fact that long-term borrowing has increased by 190 million. Well, again, I think you'll find that those figures will dovetail with what Wendy says. So I know it is a very lengthy tome, and believe me, it takes a long time for us to gather and produce it, but there is quite a lot of useful information in there if you have the time to look through it. So that's all I really wanted to say. So.
Thank you, Karen.
I think it is, yes, there is. There is any other questions or observations?
Chair, I agree with what Officer said. It's an awful lot of documentation to read, and I would be happy to suggest that if you wish, both myself and you sit down with the officers and go through any concerns or issues we want to raise separately, but note it for approval here today.
I think that's a sensible observation. Councillor Evans?
I know in this world of digital, we've got easy access to it. But might there be a sort of doorstep size document pack left in group rooms so that people don't literally have to trip over it to get into the room, so they're aware of it?
I did email, I think last week. You can do it. This is broken down into chunks and sections with a little note. Yeah. So there is an email. I know you've been away, you've been at conference, but yeah. I did send an email around. So if you wanted to analyse, say, a chunk of it, as opposed to look at it an overview, you can,
Chair, I think it's absolutely fine. I mean, I'm sure we can lodge a paper copy. In fact, probably a couple of paper copies in the members' room, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, thanks.
And also, I'm inclined to agree with Councillor Lowry. I think perhaps whilst we'll certainly approve the accounts today, because I believe there's a time frame, we've got to have them published by the 30th, is that right? This month?
Unfortunately, we will have to put a note up tomorrow to say that the publication will not be finalised, because they can't be finalised in terms of the final publication until they've been audited. And until we've finished the 1920 audit and been audited on 2021, and then audited on 21-22, we will not be able to publish a final version. So these will be subject to change, but we will be putting a note on the council's website tomorrow to notify the reasons for the delay.
Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. Perhaps we'll certainly, unless anyone else has got anything else to say about it, we'll approve them, and subject to Councillor Lowry and I having a one-to-one with officers for the minutiae. Agreed?
Chair, we'll arrange that this week so that that's in diaries. Thank you.
Moving on, we've done item number 13 because we swapped that one around. So we're going on to item number 14 of the agenda, which is the tracking decisions, which we have the usual useful summary of where we are. Is there anything to comment on the tracking decisions, which is right at the back of the document, isn't it? Here we are. So we have the tracking items, ones which have been complete, ongoing ones, item number 2.
Chair, it's my belief that at long last, item 2 has been achieved, and I understand that Ken Johnson has met with Councillor Mark Shea as finance portfolio holder.
Excellent. Any questions on?
No, it's done.
Yeah, done. Finally, last but not least, item number 15 on the agenda, the work programme. We have some works on the main programme. Anyone wants to discuss or ask whether further action points are required? Yes, Mr. Dossett.
Chair, you wouldn't mind just reading that back to Paul, would you? So it's part of the record because he didn't have a microphone on.
Yes, I think, well, Paul said the main substance of the report will come at the next meeting. Sorry, Councillor.
Yeah, can we have not that I wasn't a brilliant summary.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So the Auditor's Annual Report for 2021 and 21-22, which will be one document, will come to the next meeting of this committee at the end of November. It was due originally to come to this meeting, but hasn't been completed in time, but it will be ready for the next meeting.
Whereupon, I'm sure we will note the works programme. That looks like, unless anyone else has got any other points to add to this meeting, I mean, certainly from my point of view as chair, may I thank the officers for the comprehensive reports, and thank you all for attending. And of course, we wish Brendan a farewell. And if he is around for a drink sometime, I'm sure we'll all go and join him.
That's very kind, Chair. Thank you. And it's been a pleasure working with the committee in the recent months. Thank you.
With that being said, looking at the clock at 5:22:04, the meeting is closed.